I want to thank you for this opportunity to speak to the Commission. I am honored and privileged to do so. My name is Flint Taylor. I'm an attorney with the People's Law Office in Chicago and have been working here in Chicago both as an attorney and as a law student since 1969. During that period of time, I have focused almost exclusively on fighting against police violence and other forms of law enforcement misconduct, particularly in regards to the mistreatment and racist abuse of African American persons in the city of Chicago and across the country. I want to address you with regard to three systemic cases that I have had the opportunity to be integrally involved in, and which demonstrates not only the history of systemic police violence and misconduct in this country, particularly in Chicago, but also in terms of its connection to mass incarceration and other forms of racist violence. The first case I want to talk about is a case that I was involved in for 13 years here in the city of Chicago. It is a very important case in the history here. It has to do with the assassination of Fred Hampton, an important young Black Panther leader here in the city of Chicago by the Chicago police. Also, the murder of another Black Panther by the name of Mark Clark that same early morning on December 4th, 1969, and the wounding of several other Black Panthers who survived this murderous raid. This raid was conducted by the Chicago Police Department, 14 Chicago police officers working under the direction and control of the head prosecutor of Cook County, a man by the name of Edward Hanrahan. And also, as it later was discovered through litigation that we were involved in, it was at the behest of an FBI program called COINTELPRO, or counterintelligence. It was directed from Washington and the FBI in Washington under J. Edgar Hoover's command, and it had all sorts of illegal and unconstitutional tactics in its arsenal. And in the 60s, it focused on the Black movement and the Black liberation movement here in this country. And it focused in the late 1960s on the Black Panther Party. Fred Hampton was a 21-year-old leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. He had been recognized and targeted by the FBI under this COINTELPRO program. And this COINTELPRO program not only did surveillance, but it did disruption, neutralization, and ultimately moved to destroy the Black Panther Party here in Chicago and across the country. And as a result, an FBI informant provocateur drew a floor plan of the apartment where Fred Hampton and the other Panthers would be sleeping. They supplied that as part of the COINTELPRO program to the prosecutor, Edward V. Hanrahan, and his police officers, and 14 Chicago police officers in the dead of night, in fact, at 4:30 in the morning, raided the apartment that Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, another Panther leader, and several other Panthers who survived the raid were sleeping. 90 bullets were fired by the police from machine guns, shotguns, rifles, and handguns into the apartment. The Panthers at most fired one shot in self-defense, and Fred Hampton lay dead, assassinated in his bed as part of the COINTELPRO program. It took 13 years of litigation that myself and others from my office were involved in to uncover the fact that not only was this a police raid where it was a shoot-in, 90 bullets being fired, but that it was not only a murder in the fact that the police went into the back bedroom where Fred Hampton lay drugged by an informant and shot him through the head, but that it was an assassination, that it was in fact part of the COINTELPRO program that came from Washington. And that was uncovered by getting various FBI documents from the FBI and the government during this litigation. There was a very strong cover-up that was involved in the case, but ultimately, after 13 years, we established the fact that it was an assassination, and that history now tells that story, and that is the narrative and the truth of what happened with regard to Fred Hampton, Mark Clark, and the surviving Black Panthers here in Chicago. The second case I want to briefly touch on is the Attica cases. Although I could spend the entire period talking about it, I want to allude to it. Others in my office worked at Attica for almost 30 years, uncovering the truth of that case. As you may know, Attica was a prison and is a prison in upstate New York. That in September of 1971, the prisoners, in protest against the abhorrent conditions in the prison, took over the prison. They took some people hostages, some of the guards hostages, and they made demands on the administration. 4 days of negotiation went on, and then the governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, and the heads of the state police and the correctional officials decided to take over the prison. And they rushed the prison, and they fired thousands of rounds at the defenseless prisoners. And they killed not only scores of prisoners, but also the guards that were being held hostage. There was a massive cover-up that went on, and in the days, weeks that followed, not only was this a massacre, but there was torture. There was mass torture of the men who survived in the prison by the guards and the state police, and there were targeted assassinations of the leaders or some of the leaders of the rebellion. Attica took 30 years to expose the depth of the cover-up, and litigation went on for that 30 years. Men were prosecuted. 60 men were charged, prisoners, but ultimately they received amnesty. However, no one went to jail. None of the murderers from the state police or the correctional authorities went to jail or were prosecuted. Similarly, in the Hampton case, although there were prosecutions, no one went to jail for the murder of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. But the main thing I want to speak to you all today about is the systemic police torture that went on in the city of Chicago for some 20 years under the command of John Burge. John Burge was a Vietnam veteran who learned about police torture in Vietnam on a prisoner of war camp where torture was used against the Vietnamese. He came back to the Chicago Police Department and became a detective in 1972. In 1972, he worked on the south side of Chicago, a predominantly African-American part of the city, and he put together a squad of men who were called internally Burge's ass kickers. And they tortured individuals. And they tortured individuals in the sense that they used electric shock, they used dry submarino, placing bags over people's heads and simulating suffocation. They used mock executions with Russian roulette and other guns in the mouths of the individuals they were interrogating, and they beat the men they were interrogating on their genitals and other parts of their bodies. Over the next 20 years, this detective named John Burge was promoted promoted from detective to sergeant to lieutenant and all the way to commander of police. And during this time, he was the mastermind of a ring of torturers. And that torture went on from 1972 with the electric shocking of Anthony Holmes all the way to 1991 and the electric shocking of a 65-pound, 13-year-old juvenile by the name of Marcus Wiggins. I became involved with people in my office in the cases of police torture in the late 1980s, 1986, in the celebrated case of Andrew and Jackie Wilson. Andrew and Jackie Wilson were charged and ultimately convicted for the murder of 2 white police officers. And to get confessions from Andrew and Jackie Wilson, they were brutally tortured by Burge and his men. At this point, it was 1982, and Burge was a lieutenant in charge of an entire unit on the south side of Chicago. The torture against Andrew and Jackie included electric shock, bagging, beating, mock execution, beating over the head with a telephone book, all to get confessions to the murder of the 2 officers. Andrew got the death penalty, and Jackie got a double life sentence. Those cases highlighted the torture and brought it to light, but because Burge was high command, and also because the prosecutor by the name of Richard M. Daley, the son of the mayor, Richard J. Daley, covered up the torture. They were informed of the torture, and as prosecutors, they had the obligation to prosecute Burge and his men for the torture, but they instead not only countenanced it, but they used Burge and his men as witnesses against the Wilson brothers. This case went on for many years in federal court. Andrew Wilson brought a civil case for damages for the torture. He survived the death penalty in the sense that his case was overturned, and he ended up getting a natural life sentence. But he persevered and sought a relief for the torture, and we became involved in representing him in federal court. In 10 years of litigation, we began to uncover, with the assistance of the community and other survivors of torture, the fact that Wilson and others were not isolated instances of police torture, but this was systemic racist police torture against African-American men on the south side of the city of Chicago that lasted from 1972 to 1991. And this torture was not only participated in by many, mostly white detectives and supervisors, but it was also countenanced and known about by prosecutors who took the tortured confessions, who presented the tortured confessions in court, and who obtained convictions, sometimes sending men to death row here in Illinois. At that point, there was a death row, and to long prison terms. This racist police violence was countenanced at the highest levels of the police department and by the state's attorney of Cook County, Richie Daley. And Richie Daley not only countenanced this torture, knew about this torture, refused to prosecute this torture, but benefited politically from this torture because he was able to convict people and claim the convictions as part of his political resume by sending men on false confessions, tortured confessions, to the penitentiary and sometimes to death row. This cover-up continued and in some ways continues to the present. The fact that Daley in 1989 went on to be the mayor of the city of Chicago and was the mayor of the city of Chicago for some 20 years. And during that 20-year period, we as lawyers and the community and survivors of police torture all fought to uncover the depth and breadth of this racist violence. And in the process, we not only were able to obtain relief for men on death row, to get exonerations of people who are on death row and in prison, but we were also able to bring civil suits for redress for the men who had been falsely accused and falsely convicted of serious offenses based on tortured confessions. In the process, we not only raised this issue locally with the City Council of the City of Chicago, the county board here in Cook County, but we also took it to internationally, and we took it to not only the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, but also to the United Nations Commission on Torture. And we received reports from UNCAT condemning the torture and calling for the investigation of the torture here in the city of Chicago. That report came out in 2006, and in 2008, decades after the torture of John Burge was stopped by the police when they fired him in 1993, Burge was finally indicted. But at that point, he was indicted federally by the United States Attorney here, but he could only be indicted for obstruction of justice and for perjury for recently lying about his torture, because the statute of limitations had run on other criminal offenses, on the torture itself, and on the brutality. So Burge, ultimately, the ringleader, was convicted by a federal jury in 2010 of obstruction of justice and perjury for lying about torture. He spent 4 years in the penitentiary, and he has since died, never once admitting to the systemic torture, which now has been documented by my office and others to be over 125 cases of African-American men and women tortured by John Burge and his men over that 20-year period. Some men still remain in the penitentiary. Others have been released. Some have died in the penitentiary. Others have been fully exonerated by the courts. But the fight continues to go on to release the men who are still in the penitentiary, and also to seek compensation for those who have been released and exonerated. A significant victory of the people, intergenerational struggle here in the city of Chicago in the past period of time. Intergenerational and interracial struggle sought and obtained reparations for some 60 survivors of police torture and their families. And this was obtained by people in the streets, demonstrating, going to city council, fighting in the courts, organizing, and compelling the city of Chicago and its mayor to grant reparations. And those reparations are historic and are a milestone in this city, that 60 African-American survivors of police torture, as well as their families, received compensation, even though they were not, quote, legally, end quote, entitled to it. But most significantly, a center for treatment of police torture was set up on the south side of the city of Chicago. Also, a memorial is being built to the survivors of police torture here in the city of Chicago. The mayor and the city council made a face-to-face apology to many of the survivors of police torture, publicly condemning the acts, and most significantly, the true nature of police torture here in the city of Chicago is taught in the Chicago public schools now to 8th and 10th graders during the spring semesters. And part of that course is that survivors of police torture go to the classes and teach the young people about what they've gone through. And they talk about the systemic racist police torture and violence, which unfortunately, although perhaps not with electric shock and baggings, continues in this city. We've seen some high-profile police shootings in this city, including the Laquan McDonald case, who was shot 16 times by the Chicago police, and video was suppressed that ultimately came out, and it became of international significance. So the systemic and racist police torture that is reflected here in this city by the assassination of Fred Hampton and the murder of Mark Clark in 1969 was continued here in this city for decades with the Commander John Burge and his torture ring, torturing over 125 African-American men and women. And also the connection to the legal system, to the prosecutors who prosecuted these cases, who took these confessions, and the judges who accepted these confessions, sent these men and women to the penitentiary, did not credit the testimony of police torture for so many decades, and of course, the mass incarceration of African-American men and women that resulted from the torture. So I, again, am honored to speak to you and to urge you that about the importance of the history, not only starting when I was young, back 51 years ago, when we started working on the Fred Hampton case, but as it runs a straight line to the present, to the Laquan McDonald case, and to other recent police shooting cases, and to prosecutions and wrongful convictions that continue here in this city, in this state, and across the country. So systemic and racist police violence not only has an unfortunate and deep history here in the city of Chicago and across this country, but unfortunately has not been eradicated despite the victories that the people's movements have had, most significantly the freeing of many of the wrongfully convicted and tortured survivors, and also, of course, the reparations, which has become a model for other cities across this country. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to an important report coming from all of you. Thank you.